Good morning, dear learners, and welcome to the MOOC on Economics of Gender and Development. And we are on fourth week, and with this module 13, we'll be discussing on gender and environment. So already in our textbooks, we have discussed the things like Indian context of SIPCO movement, okay, and we see how the women tried to protect trees from felling. And here in this module particularly, we will be discussing the relationship between gender and environment, how it has evolved from essential framework to advanced transdisciplinary field known as feminist political ecology, FPE in short. So in this module, we shall examine the interlinkages between gender dynamics and environmental change through a global area of case studies, ranging from the drylands of Ghana to the industrial region of Mexico, and from the community forest of Nepal to the corporate landscapes of India. So, by analyzing how gender intersects with variables such as caste, class, nationality, and race, this module demonstrates that environmental burdens are unevenly distributed and the women's roles as resource managers are often constrained by patriarchal structures, even within egalitarian professing societies. So these conceptualized patriarchal structures, what it is, we have already come across in the previous modules. So this module concludes that achieving sustainability requires moving beyond instrumentalist views of women and integrating gender-aware subjectivities into environmental policy and governance. Now, gender has long been recognized as a critical axis of difference within environmental issues, yet the nature of its relevance remains a subject of academic debate. Early conceptualizations often polarized around two schools of thought: ecofeminism, which posited a natural affinity between women and nature, and the second one was women and environment, WED approach, which viewed women primarily as environmental managers. The contemporary scholarships has largely shifted towards feminist political ecology, as we have already mentioned. FPE in brief, we call it, an approach that emphasizes that gender is a social process inextricably linked to the material and symbolic production of environments. So environmental burdens are unevenly spread, disproportionately affecting the most marginalized and disadvantaged social categories. In the global south, for example, environmental degradation is characterized by fuel shortages, soil erosion, and climate fluctuations directly impacts the daily lives and labor intensity of women. However, in transition economies and the global north, gender-power relations continue to shape access to resources and participation in decision making. So in this module, it explores these interlinkages through specific regional case studies, highlighting how local contexts and global processes like neoliberalism and climate change redefine the gender-environment nexus. Now, looking at the theoretical frameworks, let us start with from mastery to rooted networks. The conceptual framework of dark ecology, it suggests that narratives of mastery over nature and species are co-constitutive with narratives of mastery over other humans, forming the logic part that propels anthropogenetic climate change. This class of mastery erases unequal responsibilities and consequences. In contrast, FPE, feminist political ecology concept, it advocates for a rooted networks approach, recognizing the material interdependence between people and places while making visible how power and culture are infused within these networks. Furthermore, the concept of nature cultures, within quote, nature cultures, challenges the binary opposition between the previous two concepts we have discussed, arguing that they are tightly knotted in bodies and ecologies. So within this framework, gender is not a static identity but a meaning system produced through negotiation and ecologically based struggle. As states implement neoliberal reforms, these nature society or nature cultures, as you call, interactions often produce unintended outcomes for gender equity. Now, let us discuss some of the case studies and let us begin with Africa. How it affects the gender's livelihood crisis and resistance, particularly with the gender component. So in Southern Africa, particularly in Zimbabwe, the environment enriches gender analysis by revealing how marriages mediates rights to natural resources. Okay, so what happens in resettlement areas? Women often gains access to land primarily through marriage. So upon divorce or widowhood, they lack. Okay, they lose these legal rights to remain, losing access to arable land and communal woodlands. Now, despite these vulnerabilities, women utilize their gendered knowledge of the natural environment for agency purposes. For example, the use of husband-taming herbs, mufuwaria as it is called, in rural Zimbabwe represents a human system of interaction with the environment that, while not relating to ecological crisis, speaks to the social troubles within the institution of marriage. Similarly, in West Africa, environmental stress is measured through time use. Okay? For example, in Ghana and Burkina Faso, the retreat of the forest margin forces women to spend significantly more time on fuel wood collection, increasing from less than 1 hour to nearly 5 hours per week in some areas. So this time burden leads to a zero-sum game, where time devoted to environmental coping is diverted from other productive or social activities. Similarly, in Nigeria, women's activism has historically linked environmental protection to national survival. In 1959, Funimeo Rancham Kuti challenged France's atomic testing in the Sub-Sahara region, framing the protest through the lens of mother activism and human security. This legacy continues in movements such as the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, led by Wangari Maathai, which highlighted the connection between malnutrition, cash crop production, and deforestation. Now, looking from the perspectives of Latin America and how these issues affect urbanization, labor, and ethnomedicine, we see that in the Latin America countries, rapid urbanization and the feminization of the labor force have created new sets of environmental health risks. For example, in Mexico's Maquila system, along with the US border, women comprise a significant portion of the workforce in industries generating hazardous wastes. These workers frequently report unprotected workplace exposure to unidentified chemicals, resulting in symptoms like dizziness, headaches, and respiratory problems. Now, beyond the industrial sector, agrochemical use in the export flower and vegetable industries also primarily impacts female laborers who are intensively exposed to greenhouse without proper protective gears. In the Peruvian highlands, for example, gender is linked to the environment through ethnomedicine and perception of vulnerability. Again, in Quioquio region, women are viewed as inherently debil, means weak or vulnerable, due to their biological orifices and blood loss during childbirth, which are thought to attract virus, means wind-borne illness. Now, these beliefs serve to restrict women from certain economic activities, such as gold mining in the lowlands, effectively excluding them from the most important source of family income and reinforcing gender stratification. Conversely, in Veracruz, in Mexico, the neoliberal PROCEED program, intended to privatize communal ejido lands, unintentionally empowered women. As men became apathetic towards traditional governance, women seized political openings to become registered ejidatarias and leaders, eventually using their authority to advocate for watershed protection. So this is what some positive results we see in Mexico. Now, taking the case of Europe, and we see how architecture and sustainability has changed over time. So in transition economies such as Lithuania, the legacy of Soviet equality presents a unique challenge. During the Soviet era, women achieved high levels of participation in professions like architecture due to the constitutional obligation to work. However, this numerical parity did not eliminate sex discrimination. Contemporary female architects report persistent state-sponsored patriarchy where they are marginalized in decision making and excluded from lucrative networking old boys network. So the double shift of domestic work remains almost entirely a female burden, hindering career advancements even in a profession where women represent nearly 50% of the workforce. And in Bolsonaro, we see that the FP, it reveals how gender relations shift within alternative to eco-friendly tourism and organic farming. Now, women leaders in communal organizations like Ponte de Vista advocates for sustainable practices such as the use of natural soap to prevent lake pollution. However, even in these progressive spaces, a gender division of labor persists. Men often manage the technical aspects of framing while women are stuck in the office handling the complex bureaucracy required for organic certification. Now, looking at some of the cases from Asia, particularly with reference to caste, surveillance, and pastoral mobility, we see that in Nepal, community forestry provides a lens into how gender and caste are co-produced in relation to ecological change. High caste men typically controls the management committees, while women are responsible for the labor-intensive harvesting or leaf litter. Attempts to restrict leaf litter harvesting ostensibly to improve soil fertility often prioritize scientific forestry over the practical needs of women, thereby identifying women's work with ecological decline. So these interactions demonstrate that social hierarchies like racial pollution are both reinforced and contested through daily forest labor. This we say in Nepal. Now in India, the use of digital surveillance technologies for conservation has transformed forests into masculine spaces. Okay, note these phrases, masculine spaces. In the Corbett Tiger Reserves, the deployment of camera traps and drones without local consent has inducted self-disciplinary behaviors among women forest produce collectors. Women reported feelings of shame and confusion, leading them to avoid traditional practices like singing to deter wildlife, which increases the risk of animal attacks. Furthermore, these technologies have been co-opted for moral policing, with male family members sometimes requesting access to camera trap images to monitor women's movements. Similarly, in the arid landscapes of Kutch, Gujarat, the Rabri pastoralists adapt to climate change through pacing, the flexible and precise timing of mobility. This mobility is gendered, while men focus on herding, women manage the picking and setting up of camp, often influencing the pace of travel through management of domestic chores. As climate change increases rainfall variability, these pastoralists must navigate the fast edge of industrial expansion and shifting weather patterns, balancing traditional knowledge with new technologies like motorized transport. Now, let us discuss some of the cross-cutting themes and policy implications we have seen in these case studies. Okay, let us begin with the socialization theory and the ethic of care. Socialization theory suggests that women across cultures are socialized through an ethic of care and biocentric values, while men are often socialized through anthropocentric comparative behaviors. Studies across 8 economies indicate that women consistently report stronger pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors than men. However, nationality often mitigates these attitudes more for women than for men. For example, Western women were more likely to respond to higher energy prices, while Asian women were more susceptible to peer group pressure regarding environmental actions. Now, with regard to biodiversity and trade, we see that global trade agreements like the WTO and TRIPS have gendered impacts on biodiversity conservation. Women often lead in seed savings and use of wild plants for medicine, yet these roles are frequently ignored by trade regulators that prioritize the patenting of biological resources. For example, in Bangladesh, the commoditization of common property resources like mangroves and aquatic weeds has not only destroyed local biodiversity but also increased domestic violence as traditional resources access declines. Now, after studying all these case studies, let us present an overall understanding of the discussion. Okay, and this we have done in table 1, where we have summarized the comparative statement of gender issues vis-a-vis environmental stress hazards. So we have taken basically 5 columns. Okay, we see country or region in the first column, then sector or context in the second column, then key environmental stress or hazard we see in the third column, then gender mechanism, and finally main impact on women. Okay, say in Bolsena, Italy, okay, the sector is basically organic farming and ecotourism we have discussed, and we see the key environmental stress or hazards like pollution and climate change. The gender mechanism here is we see the men control production, women handle bureaucracy and care, and the main impact on women is psychological stress and higher risk of attacks. In Brazil, okay, we see the artisans gold mining sector here. Then we see the key environmental stress is mercury vapors or malaria, and the gender mechanism is women in unpaid domestic roles exposed indirectly, and the main impact on women is neurotoxicity, immune risks, disease burden. Okay, these are the main things. And here in Burkina Faso, we see it's wildlife collection. Okay, main activity is wildlife collection. Then the key environmental stress or hazard is forest retreat or nutritional stress. Then gender mechanism we see here is that women responsible for household dietary supplements, and the impact on women we see is a time poverty, vitamin A deficiency risk we see in Burkina Faso. Similarly, in Caribbean regions we see the main activity was involved here is agriculture and tourism, and the key environmental stress or hazard is climate seasonality. The gender mechanism is women used as flexible labor reserve, and the main is gender impact is overwork or poorer land access and seasonal instability. In Ecuador, we see the sector of export agriculture, for example, flowers and vegetables. Okay, then with regard to key environmental stresses, this is intensive pesticide use and fungicide exposure. Then the gender mechanism is here indigenous women concentrated in manual spraying zones, and the main gender component is acute positioning, breast milk concentration, and chronic illness. These are the main adverse impact on gender. Then similarly in Ghana, we see the main sector was small-scale industrial agriculture. Then drought or soil erosion, this is the main thing, and the gender mechanism was patriarchal land and labor control, and the main impact of gender was long work hours and low yields and income loss. And in the Indian corporate sector, we see the main sectors are IT and manufacturing management, then VUCA business stress, then care responsibilities and rigidity of work. These are the main gender mechanism, and the gender impact main as career attrition, maternal talent drain. Again, in Indian cases of Kutch, Gujarat, we see the pastoralism or the rabari. Here, erratic rainfall and land acquisitions, these are main issues. Okay, and the main gender mechanism here was women manages camps while men herd, and the major gender problems are increased labor, social isolation, under mobility. Then also in Uttarakhand case, we see its forest collection and conservation. Then wildlife attacks and surveillance. Here also we see the camera traps, moral policing restricts women. These are the main gender mechanisms. And the main gender issues are psychological stress, higher risks of attacks. In the Mexican case, along the US border, we see the main sector was manufacturing and chemical solvents, heavy metals, toxic dust, these are the main exposure, and main gender mechanism was women hired as sheep or docile labor, and pregnancy testing used as surveillance. These are compulsory pregnancy testing, and the main problems relating to gender was occupational illness, reproductive disorders, and birth defects. Then in Nepal, the sector was community forestry, this we discussed, and the issue says soil erosion, soil pollution. The gender mechanism was high caste men controls committees and women do harvesting. And the gender issues were labor intensification, exclusion from decision making. Then in Peru, southern highlands, we saw the main sector was agriculture and informal mining, and issues noticed were wine-borne illness, beliefs of mercury. Then the gender mechanism were ethnomedicinal norms. The gender mechanism was in ethnomedical norms level women as weak and exclude them from mining. And the main gender issues were income exclusion, reproductive illness, high infant mortality. In Sri Lanka, we considered the sector of firewood collection. Issues were deforestation, small inhalation, and the gender mechanisms were firewood defined as women's work. And the main gender issues we noticed there were respiratory disease, throat cancer, and increased time burden. In Veracruz, Mexico, we considered the communist agriculture as the main sector, and land privatization and water security were the issues, and the gender mechanism was reforms, open leadership spaces for women. And in Zimbabwe, we took up the issues of agriculture and forest access. Basically, the issues we faced was the drought or deforestation, and the gender mechanism was patrilineal inheritance excludes widows or divorces. So, another dimension we need to consider when discussing the interactions between gender and environment is climate change and its effects on gender. So, in this section, we shall briefly discuss how climate change and gender and its differential impacts on developing countries. So, climate change is widely recognized as an environmental crisis with deep socio-economic repercussions, but its effects are not gender neutral. Women and girls, particularly in developing countries, often bear the brunt of climate change disruptions due to pre-existing structural inequalities in access to resources, decision-making power, and socio-economic opportunities. These disparities shape differentiated vulnerabilities and outcomes, consolidating gender inequities while undermining broader development goals such as gender equality and poverty reductions. A key dimension of gender impacts arises from resource dependency. In many low-income agrarian societies, women are primarily responsible for securing essential resources like water, firewood, and food for their households. Now, climate change-induced droughts, unpredictable rainfall, and water scarcity force women to travel longer distances for water collection, increasing their time burden and exposure to health risks. Despite their critical role in food production, women often lack land ownership, access to climate-resilient technologies, and financial resources, constraining their adaptive capacity. Historical disasters illustrate the life and death consequences of gender vulnerabilities. For example, in the devastating 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh, women aged 20 to 44 age group suffered significantly higher mortality rates compared to men due to limited mobility and restrictive gender norms that prevented them from timely evacuation. Women feared leaving homes unattended or without male permission, highlighting how socio-cultural constraints impact with climate risk to produce unequal outcomes. And beyond livelihood impacts, climate change intersects with gender-based violence. For example, research in India indicates that drought conditions are associated with elevated rates of intimate partner violence, suggesting that climate shocks can exacerbate household stressors and social tensions that disproportionately affect women's safety and well-being. This underscores the importance of integrating gender perspectives into disaster risk management and social protection strategies. Another consequence of climate change is its effects on economic empowerment and equality. Macro-level analysis shows that climate shocks and climate disasters can reduce women's economic independence by undermining their ability to generate income, participate in formal labor markets, and build human capital. These dynamics contribute to declines in gender equality overall, especially in developing states, dependent on agricultural and with limited institutional capacity to support adaptation measures. The impacts also vary with intersectional factors such as class, ethnicity, and geographical location. A recent review of sub-Saharan Africa finds that women's heightened vulnerability to climate variation systems not only from ecological exposure but also from systematic exclusion, limited land tenure rights, and inadequate representations in decision-making process. Despite these challenges, women often lead local adaptation efforts using indigenous knowledge to boost their community resilience. However, persistent policy gaps hinder effective gender-responsive climate action. Addressing the gender dimensions of climate change requires more than blanket mitigation policies. Now, gender-responsive climate adaptation and mitigation must be embedded within national strategies with targeted support to enhance women's resource access, strengthen social protection, and elevate their roles in leadership and climate governance. This approach aligns with Sustainable Development Goals that connects gender equality, which is SDG 5, with climate action, which is SDG 13, advocating for data-driven, inclusive frameworks that better reflect lived gendered experiences of climate change. So, with this discussion, let us come to the conclusion of this module. So, in this module, we have seen that the interlinkages between gender and environment are characterized by complexity, intersectionality, and constant negotiations. As shown through the different case studies, including from Indian context and global, we see that gender roles are not static. They are reshaped by urbanization, neoliberal policy, technological surveillance, and climate change. While women often embody the ethnic of care and possesses vital ecological knowledge, they continue to bear disproportionate environmental burdens and remain marginalized in high-level policy making. Effective environmental governance requires an integrated approach that recognizes gender as a central social category rather than a secondary concern. Policies must address the structural rigidities that constrain women's time use and access to resources. By moving beyond instrumentalist views of women as mere fixers for governmental problems, society can develop more ethical, economic, and ecological relationships that are grounded in the lived realities of diverse communities. Last but not the least, addressing the gender dimensions of climate change requires more than blanket mitigation policies. Gender-responsive climate adaptation and mitigation must be embedded within national strategies with targeted support to enhance women's resource access, strengthen social protection, and elevate their roles in leadership and climate governance. And finally, policymaking needs to be tailor-fit based on specific local context. So with this, we come to the end of this module. Thank you. And in the next module, we shall be discussing on role of kinship, which will be taken up by Professor Jaideep Bora. Thank you.